Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into a deeply fascinating and honestly incredibly timely question. How exactly do massive, highly complex nations adapt and survive when they are put under relentless pressure? To answer that, we're looking at Brazil. We're going to explore its institutional transformation and resilience to see how a massive state bends, shifts, and completely rewires itself from the inside out just to avoid breaking apart.
Let's start right at the beginning with Section 1, Roots of a Nation. Okay, so the history of this massive country literally starts with a tree. Picture this. European merchants arrive in the 16th century, and they discover the Brazilwood tree. When the Portuguese saw the blood-red inside of these trees, they were absolutely captivated. Because you see, this wasn't just timber for building. It produced this rich, highly lucrative red dye that was a massive status symbol back in Europe. This immediately became the region's very first cash crop, and that intense European demand acted as this overwhelming external pressure, forcing a completely new, deeply exploitative system of extraction and trade onto the indigenous populations. Actually, fun fact, the word Brazil itself is a derivative of the word brasa, which literally translates to ember, inspired by that glowing red dye. So the very name of the country is rooted in this core dynamic of extraction and transformation. I want you to keep this theme in the back of your mind as we go forward. Action and reaction. It's a cycle where immense external pressure forces a profound structural transformation just to meet the demand. Now, to see how that exact same framework applies to modern institutional stress, we're going to cover Section 2, Democracy under Stress, 3, the Congressional Government, 4, the Supreme Court's Pivot, 5, Federalism and Resistance, and finally, 6, the Resilience of Institutions. Let's dive into Section 2, Democracy under Stress. Now, to really get a grip on Brazil's recent history, researchers look at a really interesting three-part dynamic. First, you have the polity. Those are the formal rules and the rigid institutions of the regime. Second is politics, the raw, day-to-day competition and conflict among the players. And third is policy, the actual decisions and outcomes that impact people. We normally just assume the rules dictate the politics, right? But here's the twist. In a system that is under severe stress, the political competition gets so intense that the players actually end up rewriting the rules themselves, which completely alters the policies. And if you want to see that stress in action, just look at this timeline. It is wild. Over just a single decade, Brazilian democracy faced a sequence of unprecedented political shocks. We start with the massive Mensalão trial in 2012, rolling right into the historic Lava Jato, or car wash, anti-corruption operation in 2014. That massive destabilization set the stage for President Dilma Rousseff's impeachment in 2016, then the election of Jair Bolsonaro in 2018, and it all culminated in the January 8th attacks on government buildings in 2023. Any single one of these events would define a generation, but happening back to back, it formed an absolute relentless stress test on the entire system. Which brings us to Section 3, the Congressional Government. Usually, Brazil runs on a coalition presidential system. That means the president has to be the ultimate deal-maker, actively building alliances to get anything done. But recent years brought severe crises in presidential leadership. During both the Rousseff and Bolsonaro administrations, there was a systemic breakdown in that traditional executive coalition building. And nature abhors a vacuum, right? So with the executive faltering, Congress stepped right into that massive void. They captured the political agenda and actually passed constitutional amendments, empowering themselves to govern directly from the legislature. To really understand the scale of this power shift, let's put some numbers to it. Let's look at the baseline. From 2003 to 2018, the average annual spending on rapporteur budget amendments, which are essentially discretionary funds directed by Congress, was about 5.8 billion reais. But check out this structural shift. During the Bolsonaro years, that number absolutely exploded to 26.2 billion reais. That is a massive 351% jump. Congress quite literally legislated financial control for themselves. It's undeniable proof that real, hard political bargaining power had fundamentally relocated from the presidency directly into the hands of congressional leaders. And what's wild is that this financial capture was coupled with a huge change in the electoral rules. Changes that were pushed through both the courts and Congress, things like banning corporate donations and adding new performance clauses, led to a staggering 44% drop in the effective number of political parties. So think about what's happening here. The system experienced a strict cartelization of power. They concentrated vastly expanded budget resources into fewer, highly coordinated political hands. Moving right along to Section 4, the Supreme Court's Pivot. So, while the executive and legislative branches were locked in constant turmoil, the Supreme Court couldn't just sit on the sidelines. Their role expanded dramatically. They didn't just adjudicate the law anymore, they became primary veto players, actively shaping the political environment. From setting major precedents during the mental lawn scandal to actively redesigning how elections were financed, you had individual justices taking on highly active, incredibly public roles. The court basically stepped into the void left by failing institutions to directly check authoritarian overreach. But here is the crucial catch. Yes, the court successfully defended the rule of law. They acted as a vital dam against democratic attacks. They banned corporate donations, and they eventually overturned the Lava Jato convictions, dramatically altering the entire political playing field. However, this constant friction triggered what scholars call a populist trap. Because they had to repeatedly step in to stop executive overreach, the court itself became the main target for political attacks. They were accused of partisanship, which ended up significantly eroding public trust in the justice system as a whole.
Let's take it down to the regional level, in Section 5, Federalism and Resistance.
At the regional level, we see two totally different models of governance colliding head-on. The post-1988 Constitution set up what's known as cooperative federalism. That's a system built on collaborative, shared policymaking between the federal government, the states, and local municipalities. But jump to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the federal executive adopted a radically different stance. Researchers call it confrontational federalism. It was combative, it lacked federal coordination on social policies, and it heavily involved attempting to force subnational governments to just conform to the president's agenda.
So, what happened when faced with federal inaction during a global health crisis? State governors and local mayors didn't just wait around. They entirely bypassed the federal government. Empowered by Supreme Court decisions that legally protected their autonomy, states formed their own regional consortia, like the Northeast Consortium, to negotiate health measures and acquire supplies themselves. They effectively built a highly resilient, albeit unequal, brand new network of public policy delivery. They literally learned how to govern effectively around the federal crisis.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 6, the resilience of institutions. Pulling this all together, it's fascinating. Whether we are talking about 16th century timber extractors navigating European demand or 21st century politicians completely rewriting budget and electoral laws in a power vacuum, the underlying mechanism of survival is exactly the same. Intense external pressure forces the actors in the system to adapt. They learn, they bend, and ultimately, they fundamentally change the formal rules of the game just to endure the crisis. This anatomy of transformation, this continuous, unending loop of pressure, action, and structural reaction is so vital to understand. This constant cycle of crisis and adaptation isn't a flaw in Brazil's design. It is the defining characteristic of the state. Yes, the rules shape the politics, but when push comes to shove, the politics rewrite the rules. Which leaves us with a final, really provocative question to consider today. Brazil's democracy clearly survived the ultimate stress test. The system did not collapse. But did the cure permanently alter the patient? Think about it. A massive transfer of budget power to a cartelized Congress, a hyper-proactive Supreme Court, and deeply independent state governors. Were these dramatic shifts just a necessary evolution? Or have they created an entirely new, unpredictable system that future leaders are going to struggle to govern? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning how the systems around you are adapting to survive.